Well, before I get to Mr. Batista, just a couple that we had based on some of the things that we've been over in previous commission meetings. Either side's thoughts on the statewide standing of LEOBoR board, regardless of the makeup. And we have heard that this would bolster continuity of discipline and the professionalism of the panel. So, Mr. Gosselin, Mr. Kalucci, any thoughts on that from either side?
Well, I do believe that it would bolster the professionalism of the panel. I know Mr. Kalucci made a point of the makeup of the panel and the importance of having experts, so-called experts, in the profession, other police officers. But let's be mindful of the fact that the House bill specifically retains the two partials. And presumably you will have two partials on a 5-member hearing committee that are indeed experts. I would also say, and I think Mr. Kalucci didn't mention this, perhaps unintentionally, but in many cases involving discipline, you have police officers who are offering testimony of how the police officer breached the standard of conduct expected of him or her. And you also have the chief of police, who is recommending the discipline, testify about the factors or the rationale for the recommended discipline. So, Mr. Chairman, in my humble judgment, a balanced mixture of citizens with two partial police officer, so-called experts in the field, would indeed bolster the quality and the caliber of people adjudicating these cases.
Thank you. And the other question that we have based on previous meetings, commission meetings, we have heard the statute's prohibition on public statement as a barrier to transparency and limits the chief's ability to redress public speculation. Last meeting, the Attorney General discussed allowing chiefs to issue limited statements that include the officer under investigation and the reason for it. Do you feel allowing these statements would infringe on the officer's due process rights? So either one of you.
Well, that's already permitted. If I understand what the general said, that's already permitted under LEOBoR, unless we're talking about something different.
Well, I think, Mike, what the chairman's question is with respect to the so-called no public statement rule in subsection 12. And the way that actually reads is there can be no public statement, but the proviso is if it's criminal, then the agency can issue a public statement related to the officer's status and the identity of any criminal charges and administrative charges resulting from or stemming from the criminal charges. But, Mr. Chairman, in terms of transparency, I would remind this commission of the Rhode Island Supreme Court ruling in Rey Sebetta back in 1995. If you recall, that case involving a murder committed by a police officer prompted the police chief to make a public statement. In fact, he made it to some national media outlet. I believe it was called A Current Affair or something of that sort. But in any event, he moved to summarily dismiss the very serious charges, in particular murdering someone, as violative of his standards of conduct as a police officer, based on the chief's public statement. And of course, the Rhode Island Supreme Court rejected that argument. And not only did they reject it, but they questioned the constitutionality of the so-called no public statement rule, both under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 1, Sections 20 and 21 of the Rhode Island Constitution. They also cited Providence Journal Company versus Newton, a case of the federal court here in Rhode Island, holding that in the absence of showing actual interference with the fair administration of justice, an individual is empowered by the First Amendment to comment publicly on a matter subject to investigatory proceedings. So I will say this, the House bill actually has a revised public statement rule with respect to suspensions, i.e. anything less than termination, no public statement should be made. But if the officer is subject to recommended termination, then the agency may make a limited public statement, and I would encourage you to read that. Now, I think the Supreme Court here in Rhode Island has said that it is certainly important for a chief of police to be able to comment to the public at large when there is either criminal conduct or other serious misconduct by a police officer. The notion being that the public ought to be assured that the officer will be held accountable for the alleged misconduct and that the process is in play. So there are some, I think, fairly well thought out revisions in this House bill, and I would urge you to take a close look at that.
You know, I'd like to make one comment comes to mind. This goes back to the, I want to say maybe early 90s, mid 90s. And it wasn't directly involving LEOBoR, but there was a new group, a civil rights group in town, and they picked one policeman. He happened to work at their particular post and filed 19 complaints against that officer. Okay? They were all, to be gracious, creative. Okay? But they were not true. And not a one showed up for any of the hearings. Now, picture if there were 19 stories in the Providence Journal about this one officer, okay, who allegedly did all these, all were completely fabricated to the point where they laughed and didn't even show up. Imagine if there were 19 stories over the course of a couple of weeks involving this officer. There would be a public clamor for his head, and that's just not fair, okay? Oftentimes complaints are made for inappropriate reasons. Maybe it's passion. And as time goes by, I've seen many a complainant withdraw a complaint, and they've said, look, I was just upset at the time. I didn't like the fact that I got a ticket. You know, I didn't like the fact that I got stopped. But, you know, looking back, I really, I really did run the stop sign. I just was upset. So this happens, and it can happen too often. And if we stop publicizing names just on mere allegations, that's what happens, and it'll grow even worse. But I'll never forget that. It was 19 complaints. I'm not going to name the officer. I still remember it. I was at every one of them. And we don't ever want to see a repeat of that. And these things can happen.